movement. She posits that putting off childbirth in exchange for a career has high cost for the health of family and children. Her talk, part of Politically Incorrect Guide Day 2007, is 30 minutes.
Carrie Lukas is Vice President for Policy for the Independent Women's Forum, and she has her bachelor's degree from Princeton and her master's from Harvard, and she has taken on one of the most controversial subjects in the country today, feminism. Her book is called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Women, Sex, and Feminism. Please welcome Carrie Lukas.
Well, thank you all for having me here today and for coming out to hear all this information on so many different topics. And I know you're hearing many authors discuss how political correctness has infected discussions about important issues of the day. And misinformation about these topics, as you know, have grave consequences for many aspects of our lives, from our perceptions about our country and our heritage to debates about matters of public policy and our culture. And I'd argue that the commonly believed lies and misinformation about women, sex, and feminism have had the most serious effects on American culture and on our society as a whole. And debunking these pernicious myths is an important step for reversing some of the most troubling trends in our culture. And I am thrilled to be here today with Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum, which has been the leader in fighting these myths and getting the truth out there for years and years before. But I think that today, many of the most important decisions that young women make about their careers, about their relationships, and their families are being fueled in part by bad information. Much of this information is being pushed by leftist professors on campus and radical women's organizations in order to further a political agenda and to literally remake the world as we know it. And in my book, I highlight and debunk some of the most common misperceptions about women's experience in many areas of life, from the late relationship between age and infertility and the too often overlooked consequences of casual sex, to the effects of daycare and divorce on children. Today I want to begin really with the question that I believe is at the root of many of these issues, and that's the question of, are there innate differences between men and women? Now, many of you in this room are probably laughing, thinking there's a debate about this. Of course, that's just common sense. Everybody knows that there are indeed real differences between the sexes. But increasingly, acknowledging innate differences between men and women is equated with simple sexism. Just ask Larry Summers. Larry Summers, the former Clinton administration secretary, was president of Harvard. Now, from the beginning, in the eyes of Harvard, they were pretty cool to him. He was way too much of a radical right-winger for their taste. But the problems for Dr. Summers really started when he participated in an academic conference and was asked to explore the question of why there are fewer women at the upper echelons of science than there are men. And among the many explanations that Dr. Summers said was worth considering was that women, our innate abilities in the areas of science are less than men. There are fewer women who have that genius in science that is going to bring you to the tops of the field. Well, this set off an absolute firestorm. Feminist professors were stunned, and one, without irony, described almost becoming physically ill while hearing Professor Summers' comments, and because she was so distraught at the existence of this kind of feminism. I kind of wondered if any male professors had the same reaction in the room. It seems a uniquely feminine reaction, But as a result of these comments, Larry Summers is no longer president of Harvard. And he's a very vivid example of political correctness rung amok. But most of the damage is really less visible and far more insidious. Students, and particularly young women who are, especially those who haplessly stumble into women's studies classes, regularly hear from feminist professors who envision a world in which, and this is a quote, one's sex would have no more relevance than one's eye color or the length of one's toes, and who want to create a world that sees men and women as socially interchangeable. These professors argue that the qualities we associate with feminine and masculine are mere social constructs, the outcome of us dressing our little girls in pink and our little boys in blue. These beliefs may sound silly, but they've come to dominate much of our culture and much of what young men and women have come to believe. Consider what this means for relationships between men and women. Men and women are supposed to have the same expectations and desires when it comes to sex and relationships. Indeed, many women's studies professors take this a step further and suggest that our sexual liberation is synonymous with women's liberation. Students are told that in our culture, our culture, which has traditionally placed a higher value on women's chastity than men, is a real trick of the patriarchy. It's simply a way to keep women from having the fun that men are allowed to have. But young women need to realize that there's actual reasons why these norms developed in our culture, and much of those traditions are designed specifically to benefit women. The truth is that women are much more vulnerable to the consequences of casual sex than are men. Of course, there's the obvious. Women get pregnant, men don't. But few young adults realize that women are also much more vulnerable to contracting STDs, and that STDs have much more serious consequences for women than they do for men. And in fact, in the decades since the sexual revolution, rates of STDs have skyrocketed, particularly among teenagers and 20-somethings. Many young women who focused on preventing pregnancy and believe they can enjoy the fruits of sexual freedom without consequence are finding themselves with lifelong STDs, some of which affect future fertility. Now, in addition to these physical effects, women are also more vulnerable to the emotional effects of sex. While radical feminists may not want to admit it, the simple truth is that women's brains are built differently than men. Women release hormones during sex that promote bonding. These are the same hormones that women release when we breastfeed, and this is specifically designed by the body to encourage bonding between new mother and baby and a woman and her lover. This is the reason why women have a much tougher time, one of the reasons women have a much tougher time than men keeping things casual. And this is also part of the reason why, in spite feminist insistence otherwise, marriage is an institution that tends to benefit women. While women's studies books sometimes characterize marriage as a, quote, cruel trap for women. That was from one of the women's studies books that I read during the course of researching my book, and there's really some amazing stuff that's written out there. But in fact, the facts tell a really different story. They show that married women are, on average, happier, healthier, and wealthier than their divorced or single peers. And in particular, while divorce has been sold as a real road to women's liberation, the sad truth is that divorce creates its own set of problems. And surveys have shown that many who get divorced actually regret doing so and wish they'd worked harder on their marriage. I just don't think that's something that is out there in much of the culture. Now, there have been really serious consequences to the radical feminist notion that women should treat sex as recreation, and that marriage isn't a tradition designed to benefit women. Certainly, this attitude has contributed to the growing number of children being raised outside of wedlock. Consider that, just in what's happened just in my lifetime. When I was born, 1 in 10 babies was born out of wedlock. Today, it's 1 in 3 in the United States. And increasingly, research is demonstrating that this is the real dividing line between the haves and the have-nots. Children growing up with a single parent really have a tough road to climb. They're more likely to live in poverty, more likely to commit a crime, drink, smoke, abuse drugs, drop out of school, get pregnant out of wedlock, and the list could go on and on. Marriage has been aptly called the most effective anti-poverty program. But now radical feminists have a different recipe for solving this problem and providing for women. Instead of families and these voluntary relationships like marriage, feminists increasingly want women to be able to depend on Uncle Sam. Now, one example is daycare, and this is, perhaps one of the most taboo sections of my book is discussing daycare and government's role in it and really its effects on kids. Now, the feminists really envision and increasingly push for federal funding for daycare. You can bet that you'll hear more about government-funded daycare if Hillary Clinton becomes president. This is one of the things that I have some. I read through it takes a village in the course of researching my book, and it really is just a real mind-blowing look at Hillary Clinton's vision of how we should be, what our society should be doing, and how we should be taking care of our kids. No doubt, she's going to argue that there is a crisis that's affecting our children, and that daycare providers are in incredible shortage, and that parents are all clamoring for government centers to look after our children. But before the public accepts this, and before pushing government to pour money into daycare programs, policymakers should consider what actual parents, and consult with what actual parents want, and do a little research about what's actually best for kids. And surveys show that institutional daycare or organized daycare facilities are the least popular option among parents. In fact, one poll one poll found that 70% of the parents of children under age 5 thought it was best for children to have a parent at home, while just 6% thought that a quality daycare center was best for their kids. Working mothers consistently tell pollsters that they wish they could work fewer hours, not more. So if Hillary Clinton truly wanted to help women live the lives that they want to, she would be seeking ways and embracing policies that make it easier for women to spend more time at home, not finding new ways to make it easier for us to work full time. Now, research has also suggested that there are potentially adverse effects to kids spending long times in daycare. And again, this is an incredibly uncomfortable topic to talk about because parents are loath to hear that they are not doing all they can for their children. And researchers and reporters are reluctant to talk about the downsides of a choice that so many of them and their peers make. But we can't ignore this research just in the name of political correctness. There's a fantastic book written on this topic called Daycare Deception, What the Daycare Industry Isn't Telling Us. And the author highlights how reluctant researchers are to talk about this data and their findings that daycare has some negative consequences on kids. Researchers are quick to report a study that finds that kids who are in daycare are doing as well at their kids who are raised at home. But a different standard is used entirely when data shows that daycare could be of concern. And he points out, I just thought was amazing, notable child experts like Dr. Spock actually removed advice from their books. They had different editions, and during the course of rewriting these editions, they were removing advice suggesting that mothers with young children ought to separate from their children as little as possible. And when asked why they removed it, they said it wasn't because of new evidence or research, but just because they didn't want to upset women and make women feel guilty. So it was purely just because of this idea that they didn't want to talk about this topic. But in looking at the many studies on daycare, the evidence does suggest that children who spend long periods in daycare centers are more likely to exhibit problems, including behavioral and detachment disorders, than peers raised at home. The kids in high-quality centers are less likely to show these ill effects, and they may enjoy some, and there are some benefits. They do show some increased levels of socialization at these young ages. But no doubt, I think what this research suggests, that encouraging greater use of institutional care, particularly institutional care brought to you by the government, would be the wrong direction for the country and the direction that parents don't want to go. And I think the real reason that feminists crave universal child care and are reluctant to acknowledge the downsides to outsourcing parenting is because they desperately want women to achieve parity in the workplace. The feminist movement is endlessly frustrated by the fact that women continue to lag behind men in terms of economic prowess. And I'm sure you've all heard the rallying cry, equal pay for equal work, and the statistic that women make about 75 cents for a man's dollar. This is often referred to as the wage gap, and it's the difference in the amount of money made by the median full-time working woman and the median full-time working man. And there is no debate. The average median woman does indeed make about 3/4 of what a man makes. This is a statistic that's put out by the Department of Labor regularly, and it always shows about the same numbers. But what this statistic, as with many statistics, what this statistic reveals is really a lot less than what it is leaving out and what it ignores. And in fact, this ignores all of the relevant factors that affect pay, such as the number of hours worked, education, career choice, years of experience. In short, it ignores the very different role that work plays in men and women's lives. In truth, I think I'm the cause of the wage gap. Me and tens of thousands of women like me. I've got a good education, but throughout my career, I've made things other than money a priority. I went into public policy instead of investment banking. A few years ago, when I knew I was going to want to start a family, I left Capitol Hill and took a pay cut so I could work somewhere at a nonprofit organization that would give me the flexibility to spend more time with my family. When I had my first daughter, almost 2 years ago now, I opted to work. I started working full-time from home. Now, I'm not making as much money as I could, but I'm compensated by having the absolute best work arrangement I could possibly hope for. But in the feminist lens, and the feminists keep trying to convince me that I should be really mad. The tax returns of the men I graduated from college with are undoubtedly more impressive than mine. But I know that I've simply made very different choices that made sense for my life. Now, one thing I find really interesting about the feminist fixation on the wage gap is how much it assumes that men have the right priorities and women have the wrong priorities. In fact, surveys have shown that when evaluating jobs, men tend to place a higher emphasis on pay than women do. While women have of course we care about how much we're getting paid, we also care about things like personal fulfillment and flexibility. And in fact, if you look at what jobs men tend to take on, men often take on dirty, more dangerous, and more depressing jobs, in particular in order to make money. They work longer hours. They take less time off. Now, women have very different priorities, and this is just reflected. And this all makes sense when you think about this as supply and demand, and why it is that that a lot of people are willing to work as librarians and take less money for it. Well, it's harder to find. You got to pay extra to find someone willing to be a prison guard, in part because of the danger and inconvenience and depressing nature of the job. In other words, when you start thinking about these issues, you recognize that women are generally not victims of discrimination. Of course, there are instances of discrimination. There's instances of discrimination against women, and there's instances of discrimination against men. But we shouldn't all go out there assuming, especially the young women in this room, shouldn't all go out there assuming that you're going to be systematically discriminated against. That's just not a healthy way to look at the world. You should recognize that you're going to be making choices, and those choices have consequences. Instead of feeling like victims, women should think about the choices they're making, think about their priorities, and that's one way that will help you. If getting higher pay is a priority, that'll, if you think about that and know that these are the choices that you're going to face, that'll help you achieve that goal. Now, the feminist misinformation campaign does more than just make individual women less happy. It also affects conversations about public policy. In fact, Senator Clinton has proposed legislation that would, quote unquote, get rid of the wage gap. And this would micromanage how wages are set. Now, this could have serious consequences for our economy and really have serious consequences for individual women. Employers, if this were put into place, employers would have less incentive to offer the flexible work arrangements that are the very work arrangements that many women crave. If I'm an employer, why would I open myself up to a lawsuit by allowing a female employee to take a reduction in salary so that she could leave early every day to pick up her kids? Or take off sick days, or arrange with her employer that any time there's a snow day, that means I'm going to take off. I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to have to explain why her male colleague with the same title, with the same responsibilities, made more money. Instead, I would take away this flexibility, and it would really be a tremendous detriment to women. Now, these are just a few examples of how the feminists propagate a skewed perspective about women and the decisions we face in our lives and the serious consequences it can have in society. There are many other issues I cover in my book. A lot of it talks about public policy and a whole bunch of other issues. And so I'd love to open it up now to questions. But in general, I just want to close by saying, simply put, men and women aren't the same, and we don't have to be the same to be equal. And I think recognizing that simple fact is a real first step, an important step in rebuilding a healthier society. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Carrie. Have you heard about any women's studies department using your book as a textbook?
No, I'd be shocked.
I believe it was Phyllis Schlafly who first, years ago, identified what she called daycare syndrome, DCS. In other words, anytime you have a child in daycare, about every 6 to 8 weeks that you can expect that the child will get sick. Everything from pink eye, ear, nose, and throat infections. And then if you're a working mother, you obviously have to take off. So I've been quoting Phyllis Schlafly, daycare syndrome, for many years.
Well, when Bernard Goldberg wrote his book about bias in CBS, he said the biggest story you will never see on television is what's wrong with daycare. The feminists will not let it on. Yes. Question for Ms. Lukas.
Will you please talk about your feelings on women in the military and or on the front lines?
I have to say that's not an issue that I've studied much. I do think that it's that one of the it is a symptom of this unwillingness to understand that there are differences between men and women in terms of physical strength and vulnerability and expectations. And we see it all the time, as much as even those who are real supporters of women in the military, I think know that when an incident happens in which a woman is involved in heavy combat or gets captured, we have a different reaction to it. You think about what happened with Jessica Lynch. We all recoiled, and there was this extra, obviously we're all horrified anytime one of our soldiers is captured, but everyone, I think, was particularly horrified at the idea of a woman being put in this vulnerable position. And I think that's something that we really do have to consider. And I truly believe that women have an active role we can play in the military, but there is some real dangers, and I think that we need to think hard about that before putting women out there in positions that endanger them and endanger the men who are trying to defend them, as is often ends up being the case.
I just know that on my college campus, me and several other girls who have expressed interest in graduating, getting married, and having a family have been shunned from doing that. You have an education now, go out, get a career, do something good in the world, and we need to really change how that's viewed in society, that raising kids is no longer noble. And I think that especially now hearing about Hillary Clinton wanting to put our kids in daycare so we can work full-time is just the worst thing that we can do. And I'm wondering, what would you we should get something published, or take your book to our campus and just show our professors that it's actually going to harm our future more than if we did have a career and ignore our children. So
it's really interesting, because I think that one thing that that few women understand, I certainly didn't think about this when I was in college. I didn't really understand just how much children were going to become this incredible focus in my life. And there's really interesting research about this. There's a book out there that's called The Female Brain, and I would encourage, and this isn't written by a conservative woman, it's really a doctor looking at just how different women's brains are and how we change over time. And one thing that I just found amazing was literally the idea of baby lust, this idea that women start to crave and have this physical craving to have children, how it's a physical thing. It actually happens. Your brain starts to rewire, and as someone who just gave birth a month ago, I had my second, 1 month birthday. It totally changes your perspective, and it is something that I think that a lot of my peers who didn't think about it earlier think, like, what am I going to do once I have children? It really puts you in a bind, because even if you don't think it through early, you run the risk of, first of all, not being able to have kids. I think that another of the most under-discussed stories, at least among 20-somethings, is the relationship between age and fertility. I was amazed looking at some of the, you look at how much time and ink is spent in women's studies book about abortion, and that there was almost no discussion about problems with fertility for women who want to get pregnant. There's this one of my favorite quotes from a women's studies book that I have in my book is someone who. This one women's studies book describes, it spends about 5 or 6 pages on the idea of men having a menstrual cycle, or something equivalent to a menstrual cycle, truly like ridiculous, far out there stuff. And then when discussing fertility, it says women begin ovulating, and then at around the age between 40 and 50, we go through menopause. This causes great angst, something like it causes great angst for women, because bearing children is something that much of our culture places a lot of importance on, as if this was something that women didn't care about, as if this was something that came from the outside. Anyway, but I think that there is a real lack of understanding of just the fact that fertility problems don't start in their 40s. For many women, they start much earlier than that. And I know from friends that have struggled to get pregnant. I'm almost 34 now, and it's a lot of my friends have struggled with pregnancy, and that's something that we weren't taught to consider or thought to consider about when we were in our 20s. In addition to thinking about how we want to balance work and family, I think that thinking about how you want kids fit in your life, and if it is your number one priority, that's something you shouldn't shy away from trying to build into your expectations and your plans.
Since 1969 and the passing of no-fault divorce, we've all seen that divorce revolution in America that's taken place. What do you think would be one of the most helpful policies that we could help promote in order to restore the family and marriage to its rightful place?
It's really interesting, because I do think that while there's this idea that the change in the 2 no-fault divorce laws was liberating, and it, of course, obviously made divorce much easier, there are some, it also shut off options for many people, which are creating a marriage contract that actually means you've got to that really kind of ties your hands or makes it much harder for you to divorce. I think it's really encouraging and interesting that some states are looking at creating different kinds of marriage contracts, things that go back or basically make it so it is much more difficult. It takes more time to get a divorce. I think that from a public policy level, that's something that I think is worth states exploring. But I really think that for the most part, this isn't something that's going to be able to happen through public policy. This is something that's going to have to happen in the culture and in conversations, and particularly among, I actually am pretty optimistic that young people, particular those who grew up with divorced parents and or have seen divorces among their peers, they know a lot of the problems with divorce. And I think that there's going to be, in this younger generation, perhaps there will be a greater respect for marriage and this idea that that we need to stick it out, and that marriage isn't all happily ever after. That I think people need to have a lot more realistic view of marriage as not being, not to sound down on it, but then it's not all that you need to really stick through the tough times as well as enjoy the good times.
I want to ask you one more question about this nutty notion of the feminists. Now, it seems to me when I started out fighting the feminists, their theory was that God goofed in making us of two different kinds, genders, and they were out to remedy his mistake, or sometimes I say her mistake. They say. But now they seem to be, aren't they teaching in the women's studies courses that maybe we were made the same, and that gender differences are a social construct, and we do that to little boys and little girls to make them different. Isn't that what they're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really funny, though, because I think there's almost this schizophrenia among feminists about this, because certainly they ignore evidence of innate differences between the genders, but except when it's in women's favor. We are allowed to find on tests that women are better, have more highly developed verbal skills, for example. But if you say anything about men being better at math, then you're simply a sexist. It's funny, this is often really obvious in discussions about Title IX, and this is, most often Title IX is used to try to create gender parity just in athletics, to get just as many women competing in sports as there are men. And colleges and universities they cut men's teams. And the interesting thing is that no matter, but the simple fact, and this is shown in survey after survey, is that women aren't as interested in sports as men are. Again, I'm sure everyone here is shocked that, and is surprised to know that there's a lot of money being poured into finding that, really controversial fact, but the interesting thing is that we don't look at music programs, we don't look at plays, we don't look at participation in student government or newspapers. All of those things are heavily dominated by women in high schools and colleges. We only care when it is the one area where men continue to out-participate women, and that's in sports. And it just shows how much this really is the feminists. They use the idea that men and women are exactly the same when it suits them, but not at other times when it's
right. And I wish we had more time to talk about Title IX, but you can go on our website, eagleforum.org, and get some very interesting material on Title IX. We want to thank Carrie Lukas for coming. Her book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to Women's Sex and Feminism. Thank you.
The Politically Incorrect Guide to Women, Sex, and Feminism. Carrie Lukas is the Vice President for Policy and Economics at the Independent Women's Forum. She contributes to the National Review Online and has worked on the House Republican Policy Committee and the House Select Committee on Homeland Security. This event was part of Politically Incorrect Guide Day 2007, sponsored by the Eagle Forum. For more information, visit eagleforum.org.